Hello and a warm welcome to this 1-hour session entitled Making Human Rights Due Diligence Work for Home Workers. We're focusing today on home workers within the garment and footwear sector. My name is Rohan Preece and I'm a consultant with Transform Trade, formerly Tradecraft Exchange. Home workers are a varied group of workers, mainly women, who are often overlooked or otherwise not properly understood within due diligence initiatives, but who nonetheless play a vital role within garment, footwear, and other supply chains around the world. We're very fortunate to have with us today a panel of experts whose collective experience encompasses extensive work within global supply chains in which home workers are active. Today, our panel will help us to explore how to approach human rights due diligence for home workers, consider how best to extend due diligence beyond Tier 1 factories to increase visibility on subcontracting practices and therefore on home working and other kinds of informal work beyond factories, which, as we know, are a major part of garment and footwear supply chains. We'll also be trying to understand some of the best practices that have been adopted by leading brands and MSIs to enable effective ways of actually increasing transparency to ensure that due diligence processes actually reach home workers, who represent some of the most vulnerable workers in garment and footwear supply chains. Please note that today's session is being recorded. It will be interactive, and there will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions to the panelists. Firstly, though, I would like to invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and please share what has actually brought you to this panel. And firstly, I'd like to invite Marlese.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Marlese van Broembsen. I'm the Law Program Director of WIEGO, which is Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. We are a research advocacy network. It's a network of organizations of informal workers in 4 sectors, including home workers. I'm on this panel, and thank you very much for the invitation, because we've been working with 14 organizations of home workers in 8 garment production countries to engage with this EU directive process, the Directive on Corporate Sustainability. They've engaged both directly with EU policymakers and indirectly through our membership of the Clean Clothes campaign. And the issues for home workers in relation to the directive are twofold. The first is for the directive and any human rights due diligence legislation to include all workers in all tiers of the supply chain, including home workers. And the second issue, and that's a more complex one to unpack, which I want to hear, which is around access to justice and what that would mean for home workers. Thank you, Ronan.
Thank you, Marlese. Mousumi, please come to the discussion.
Thank you, Rohan. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mousumi Sarangi, and I work with Fair Wear Foundation. Fair Wear is a multi-stakeholder initiative, an organization that works in the textile supply chain, primarily in the first tier. But we vision a world where garment workers are supported to ensure safe, dignified, and properly paid employment. We work with the industry, trade unions, and labor rights organization as we operationalize our human rights due diligence, showing with our member brands that change is possible. And when we envision this dream, home workers cannot be forgotten in this world of work. Home workers that make about 100 million workers around the world, of which about 50% is from Asia, and Asia producing 60% of this garment production. So a very integral part of the supply chain. The other point that I'd like to reflect on is the fragmentation of the industry, which involves many actors across the globe with varying levels of power and influence. And to reach our goal, our dream, where each worker has a right to safe, dignified, and properly paid employment, every link of the supply chain must bear its proportionate weight and take up its role in ensuring that the chain is strong and equitable. And in that way, home workers have been increasingly put to the threshold of unequal global production demands, push down the supply chain, facing decreased power, earnings, and bear increasing costs and risks. So as Fair Wear, we want to show our solidarity and work where we monitor home workers in our supply chain and aspire to achieve equal treatment for home workers in lines with the ILO convention, as well as our own Fair Wear Code of Labor practices. We do not encourage our members to ban homework because it's like driving homeworking processes, making them more invisible and precarious. We are here to share some of our experiences and take the learnings from this August panelists back to our own organization for a more robust working system with home workers. Thank you, Rohan.
Thank you, Mousumi. Sarbani.
Thank you. Thank you, Rohan. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sarbani Kattel, and I'm currently working as a program coordinator for HNI, which is a global network of membership-based workers organization representing home-based workers from around the world. We currently have 74 affiliates from 32 countries from 5 regions. I was previously working with HomeNet South Asia, which is a regional network of home-based worker organization across South Asia with 60 home-based worker organizations representing more than 1.2 million workers. And I'm based out of Kathmandu, Nepal. So we work directly with home workers and home-based worker organizations for their recognition and visibility. So we had been engaged in producing many research studies on home-based workers and their working condition within the supply chain. And our latest one is on the decent work deficit of home workers in selected cities in South Asia. So we anticipate that this report will be out sometime next week. So thank you. Thank you, Rohan. Back to you.
Thank you. Kohila.
Thanks, Rogan. Hello, everyone. I'm Kohila. I work with an organization called Cividep India. We are based in Bangalore. Cividep India is a labor rights organization working with marginalized women workers, especially who are part of global supply chain in the sector like garment, leather, electronics, tea, and plantation. So Cividep has been working with home workers in the leather footwear supply chain in Nambur for more than a decade now. And Cividep has been part of the Hidden Home Workers Project. And we recently conducted a study to explore the possibility of home workers linkage to the global supply chain and their working condition. I'm here to share some of the major findings of the study. Thank you, Rogan.
Thank you, Kohila. And Lucy.
Hello, my name is Lucy Brill. I work for an organisation called Home Workers Worldwide. We were set up after the campaign for the ILO Convention on Home Working in 1996. We've worked with civil society organisations and trade unions, reaching out to home workers in many countries, most recently through Hidden Home Workers, working in India, Pakistan and Nepal. I mean, our role within Hidden Home Workers has been to reach out to brands and multi-stakeholder initiatives, building on the work that we did with Cividep in South India about 2 or 3 years ago now. But we're really keen to find ways that we can include home workers within human rights due diligence processes. So it's great to have this opportunity to share with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. And we now move into the panel discussion section, during which I will be posing 2 questions to panelists, which are central really to understanding how to make due diligence work for home workers. The session will last for around 15 to 18 minutes. And after this, there'll be an opportunity for all of you in attendance to pose questions directly to the panelists. So in the meantime, do please write any questions you have into the chat, and these will be collated and fielded to the panelists in due course. My first question is this: what are the challenges involved in extending due diligence right along supply chains to actually include home workers, who are often, if not usually, the lowest paid workers within those chains. And I'd like Sarbani particularly, I'd be interested to hear your response to that, Kohila, and then Mousumi and Lucy, please.
Thank you, Rohan. One of the main challenges that we see is that the supply chain itself is designed and it's not set up by default. And when the supply chain are designed, they ensure that there are many tiers within the supply chain, and employers get work done at a much cheaper rate and whenever they need it. So employers and brands actually benefit from the multiple tiers that we have and that we see in the supply chain. So retailer companies or even brands sometimes, they want more labor. Sometimes they want less labor based on the seasonal products. And the factories that they have contracts with already have enough laborers to work on the particular product. So they look for workers where they do not need to retain them or provide consistent work or even provide social security benefits. And this is where home workers come in. So just in Asia alone, more than 60% of garment production is undertaken by home workers. In South Asia, it is estimated that there are over 60 million home-based workers in just 4 countries, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And millions remain in the shadows and they go unaccounted for in the national statistics. So home workers, they basically work from within their home. Sometimes they work in adjacent areas. Sometimes they group together for 4 to 5 workers who work together in community spaces. So, and they work, the work is provided on a piece rate basis. So there are many production hubs in many countries. And taking an example from Tirupur, India, we see that home workers work anywhere between 10 to 12 hours when they get work, and work is often irregular. And when they do receive work, they are pressured to finish it in time. So they work for long hours beyond what factory workers do. And home workers, they even call them not skilled. Their work is called not skilled, like stitching buttons, cutting extra thread, packing, folding, and so on. And they get paid 1/3 of the minimum wage. So this situation is familiar for home workers working in different parts of the world. So the thing is that home workers will basically never find out who their primary employer is. They only know the subcontractor above them, who could be their neighbor, their family person living in the community, or just an intermediary that provides them work. Therefore, the supply chain is basically designed to keep all this information hidden, and home workers are not being recognized as workers. They're not being recognized as workers by their employers or even by the government. Therefore, it becomes extremely difficult and challenging to extend due diligence for category of workers who are basically not recognized as workers. Thank you, Rohan. Back to you.
Right. Thank you, Sarbani. Kohila, do you have any other points you'd like to add around challenges in extending due diligence to home workers?
Yeah, sure, Robert. Actually, if we look at the leather supply chain, the home workers in the leather supply chain, they don't have any proper documents or work agreement to prove their employment conditions. They work extremely in an informal situation outside of the factory from their home. None of the home workers we interviewed ever met the factory representative. Often home workers are not aware whom they are produced for and their supplier factory detail as well as the brand details. Their relationship with the their work relationship, it's limited to the agent who supply the work. So in addition to that, the home working is extremely irregular and seasonal in the leather supply chain. Certain months the home workers get excessive work, and during certain period they don't get any work at all. So often the contractor decide to whom they have to provide employment. So because of the lack of transparency again in the supply chain, home workers are at the mercy of the contractor for their work and payment. Hence, they are home workers are afraid of raising their concerns in the supply chain. It makes them more invisible in the supply chain. Apart from that, lack of statutory coverage make the situation even more worse. And often brands take that as an advantage for not covering their due diligence process.
Right. You've mentioned transparency. Lucy, would you like to add any particular challenges around transparency? And then perhaps Mousumi, you may also like to add some relevant points.
Yeah, I mean, just really to build on what Kohila and Sarbani said, I mean, there is a real problem that because homeworking isn't recognised by brands, and even some brands have a policy that they ban homeworking. As a result, suppliers, if a brand goes and says you can't do this, the supplier is certainly not going to disclose that they do have homeworkers within their supply chain, and we end up with a cycle of denial that homeworking gets pushed further and further underground, and as a result, it becomes more, that the supplier and the subcontractors will tell the agents and the home workers not to speak out, not to talk about what they're doing. And as a result, it becomes harder and harder for the home workers, if they wanted to disclose, to speak out and report any concerns that they have, it becomes very difficult for them to do that. So I think that is the key challenge. I think that lack of recognition even extends sometimes to home workers themselves, that they don't recognise that themselves as workers with rights, that should be able to claim those rights.
Thanks, Lucy. Mousumi, are there any other broader supply chain level challenges that you would like to reflect on?
I'd like to bring in 2 points. One is we've heard that the lack of voice, we've heard from all the 3 colleagues in the panel today. So home workers are largely in many contexts not organized in trade unions, and therefore a lot of times not recognized as workers, which limits their negotiating power with the employer or intermediaries like subcontractors. And if you look at the whole legislative ecosystem, there are rights, but to make the rights implemented, you need a voice to ask for them. They have to be implemented. Because there is limited voice, there is limited effort also to provide that ecosystem where home workers have conducive working systems. So one is the need for home workers to be more organized, more unified in their ask towards their employers, even if it is a subcontractor. Second that I'd like to bring in is the monitoring and evaluation of any workplace is challenging. And when home working is concerned, it even becomes a bigger challenge, because for most production, sites, in theory, it is the first year. If you look at international brands, in theory, it is the first year. It's not looked beyond the first year in many cases, because the risks, the costs of monitoring, providing those ecosystems of conducive working doesn't fit the business model, right? So we have to make home workers more visible in the supply chain. We have to make principal employers more accountable of where their production is being taking place. And for that, we also have to have brands pay a price that makes this more visible. One of the reasons is that what goes down the supply chain is lower prices. Home workers are generally paid by piece. You don't have to maintain any overhead costs. To hire them, you don't have to maintain costs of manufacturing, providing them social security, infrastructure, health and safety. Because of that, the pricing model supports businesses in many ways. So we have to look at, when we talk of a unified voice, of better wages for home workers. When this voice becomes stronger, I think they'll become more visible and their rights will also be more acknowledged. Thank you, Rohan.
Thank you, Mousumi. There are quite a number of very relevant points there, which perhaps we can bring together. Challenges around transparency, some structural issues around how it's difficult for home workers to organize and freely associate. And we've also mentioned issues around low wages and so on. Now, challenges are there. Are there things that we can actually do constructively to address these challenges? Are there ways forward? Can the challenges be overcome? And indeed, do we have any examples of where progress has already been made? That's the next question. I'd like to invite Marlese to share some of her reflections initially.
Thank you. So HomeNet South Asia, Southeast Asia and International, HomeNet International are members of WIEGO, and I will leave the practical pieces to Sarbani to answer. I'm going to come at it as a lawyer. And to start with the importance firstly of national labor legislation needing to recognize home workers. So, sorry, with the exception of Thailand, some states in Pakistan and in the Philippines, home workers are seen as independent contractors, and so therefore don't have rights at a national level. And so here, Convention 177 of the ILO stipulates that home workers should be treated as just like other employees. But even if home workers are protected by national legislation, there are multiple employers in a supply chain. We've got the intermediaries, we've got the factories and the brands. And so it's important to have supply chain legislation. And here, in terms of the draft directive, the EU draft directive on corporate sustainability, the key thing is that it covers the whole chain, all workers in all tiers of the chain, including home workers. In terms of progress, I think we can point to two things. One is that the draft directive does cover the whole chain. And then we have module 12 of the OECD Due Diligence guidance for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. And that sets out how to incorporate, for brands to incorporate home workers. And if I can quickly outline 4 things here. So the one is that businesses should contractually oblige their suppliers to keep a record of home workers, both the quantity of goods and how much they're paid per piece, and to ensure that the piece rates equals the minimum wage. Secondly, there needs to be education and training of factories and the intermediaries about the labor rights of home workers. Thirdly, they should be engaging with partnering organizations concerned with formalizing homework. And then finally, engaging with national governments to provide home workers with rights to social security. At a national level, we've got the example of the Australian Fair Work Act that models how this can be realized through legislation. And then just finally, the points everybody here has raised, the invisibility, the lack of contracts, the lack of recognition. And most home workers, as has been said, don't know who they produce for. And so I think it's going to be critical for legislation to say that all workers, brands should compel their suppliers that all workers must have contracts and the name of the brand must be in the contract. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Marlese, for that really helpful set of constructive proposals. Lucy, would you like to add some perspectives?
Sorry, I've misplaced. I think drawing on the work that we've done with brands in the footwear sector, the first step really is for brands to adopt a home workers policy to make it clear to their suppliers that they do recognise home workers and that they recognise that they may well be involved in their supply chain, and that they invite suppliers and subcontractors to disclose their presence and to take steps to improve conditions. I think it's at the moment there are also opportunities within the proposed legislation again to recognise home working, and I think that's why it's so important that legislation goes beyond tier 1. We know that home workers are almost always not directly employed by factories, but employed by subcontractors or agents, and as a result, it is really important that legislation is inclusive. Otherwise, home workers could be adversely impacted by legislation that doesn't recognise the importance of going right along supply chains. Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit more. I mean, we have, through the Hidden Home Workers project at the moment, we've had an opportunity to carry out some research with practitioners and brands that have reached out to home working in within supply chains. And we've drawn on the learning from that work to produce a toolkit that includes very practical templates and systems that brands and suppliers can use to monitor home working, to regulate home working. For example, how do you set a fair piece rate? How do you run maybe a time and motion study, or how do you bring home workers together to compare notes on the time that it takes to produce particular products and log that work against minimum wage, or ideally even living wage. So that there is good practice out there. It has been done. It is possible to manage homework effectively and efficiently and ethically. So we would really encourage brands to check out those resources and to get in touch with us if we can help further. I think it's probably, I'm happy to answer more questions on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lucy. And the first step is to really map supply chains, isn't it, and understand where home workers are, where challenges may be, what some of the conditions are, and I think that's crucial to transparency, as we've touched upon. Sarbani, would you like to add any points on how some of the challenges can be overcome, and indeed any other panelists, if they'd like to add any other points that they may have not done yet?
Sure, thank you, Rohan. So the most important aspect is to bring employers accountable and for them to recognize workers within their supply chain. Not just employers, we also need the government to hold the employers responsible and also be responsible for the workers of their country. And for us, this can be done by two manners. One is by organizing, and the other one is by building the capacity of home workers. So home workers, they need to be organized locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. And this is what HomeNet International is doing. So it is a global supply chain, and therefore it is a global issue. And it is one of the reasons why we have built HomeNet International, which is currently working in 5 regions: in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So workers needs to be organized at all levels, and their capacity needs to be built so that they can advocate for their recognition, so that they can advocate for laws to protect themselves and also hold employer and government responsible. So the labor law in many countries, they hardly recognize home workers as employees. So however, the ILO Convention C177 on homework mentions that home workers should be treated like any other employees in the supply chain. So it is important to build their capacity so that they can advocate for C177 ratification and also amendment of the national labor laws to include home workers. So as a global network of home-based workers, we're also pushing for the ratification of C177 and for a home-based worker policy. Lastly, it is also important to build their capacity so that they can voice out for specific demands from the employers, such as contracts, passbooks, and also be included within their grievance system, where workers have rights to. So that's all. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Sarbani. And I'll just quickly invite any other panelists to comment on this. We've had some questions in the chat, and they have been helpfully responded to. We do continue to invite questions. I'd ask Kratika if you could just help me locate any questions that haven't been asked or haven't been answered, rather.
Rohan, I'll share the MSI perspective a little bit on what can be done.
Please. please.
If I look at it broadly, the multi-stakeholders can serve as an effective platform for dialogue, research, sharing of best practices among business, civil society, unions, and academia, which can help shift this consciousness around legislation and play a significant role in generating political will to make more stringent laws. You know, we've had soft laws, guidelines of including home workers, but it's not reached the amount of success that we would all want to. Maybe these platforms can be an ideal, one of the ideal ways of how we can address this issue, bring more conversations and consciousness for harder laws in this area. Particularly if I look at Fair, what we do when it comes to home working, I'd like to share. We have a policy guidance on home-based work that specifies what Fairware member brands can do and should do to identify, prevent, remediate violations of the Fairware Code of Labor Practices towards home workers. This is a guidance that focuses on home work that is used in processes of producing swing goods under the manufacturing supply chain. So this is mandatory for the Fairware members to monitor. Members are required to include home workers places in their monitoring if it is in the swing production department. Though our audits do not cover home working spaces, but we do provide guidance to members that they need to solicit necessary information of where the homework is being done. Are they being given the required facilities in terms of wages, social security? And the member needs to at least visit, the member brand needs to at least visit 20% of the home worker facilities, document what they have seen and follow up on issues that they have been found. So this is an area where, particularly if there is awareness or the mapping has been already done by the member brand, that they also need to share this with Fairware, and every year this needs to be updated in our database of where the supply chain is when it comes to home workers, if they know, and who are their contractors, who are their suppliers. So when you have data and information, it helps in policy making, specifically with the new legislation coming up. I think this data would be very useful to hold brands accountable, to voice for better rights for home workers, both at the production country level and at the international level, where brands are there and where they have a role to play in supporting addressing some of these rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions, so I will just take a minute to collate those. Mousumi, perhaps you may like to comment actually before we move on to the other questions on e-Shram. Sehuang has asked a question about whether that can really help to address some of the problems that home workers face. While you're responding to that, I'll then look at some of the other questions.
Just to clarify, you mean the e-Shram portal?
Yes, right.
So, we've heard from the beginning of this conversation that home workers are invisible, and we need to make ourselves visible to our country legislation, that we are not, one in many. We are a bulk of your, workforce. And the e-Shram portal, whether it is able to give those rights or not is secondary, but it'll at least make it visible to the government that this is your, force of labor that you have at home, which at this moment is very muddled. We don't have enough data. That is why also we are not able to push for the right reforms. We are not able to ask for those legitimate rights because it's not looked at as a big number. And I think this e-Shram portal, whether it's able to translate it into rights, but at least will make us more visible to the government and help us then drive policy discussions.
Right. Thank you, Mousumi. There are a couple of questions about how brands can actually help to extend due diligence. There's one question from Ghazala, and there's also another question from Dimitra, and indeed another question from Romain. Lucy, would you be able to broadly answer that question about what steps brands can take really to facilitate due diligence to home working, and also touch on the question of challenges around trust vis-a-vis suppliers as well?
Okay, yeah, I mean, the first step really is for brands to make it clear to suppliers that they do recognise home workers as workers. Many, as I said before, many brands have a policy of banning home working, and as a result, suppliers will assume that brands don't want home workers within their supply chains. So it's really important that brands start by adopting a clear policy, including that within your supplier handbook or as a standalone policy, and then bring that to the attention of the supplier when you're involved, when you're doing audit visits or discussions with them. Invite them to disclose, make it clear that that's okay. I mean, if home working is disclosed, I mean, it's also useful to be engaging with local stakeholders. For example, the work we did on leather footwear was very much grounded on the research that Cividep had carried out, documenting that home working was indeed present within that supply chain. And the brand, one of the brands that took action, that worked with us, was able to use that research and took that to the supplier and asked them, you know, this is obviously going on in this area. Is this something that you're involved in? And because that supplier has sufficient trust with the brand, I mean, it is all about trust. The supplier actually disclosed that, yes, we do use home working. And we were then able to build a project to begin to map that supply chain. So to carry out a series of interviews with different stakeholders along the chain. So, but it is, in order to do that, there's a process of building trust that has to pass down the chain. So the trust that we had with the brand was then able to introduce our partner on the ground, Cividep, to the local subcontractor. That was not necessarily a straightforward process. That takes time, it takes energy. But interviews to then understand how the home working relationship is currently managed. What's the current system? Because very much, if you understand what is going on now, there will be some system. If work is going out to 100 women in different villages, there will be a system for managing that work. It may just be in the heads of certain people, but it's understanding what's going on at the moment. And interviewing all parties in that chain. So interviewing the intermediaries, what role are they playing? Are they transporting product, for example? Are they carrying out quality control? Are they training new home workers? They're almost certainly also managing the payments. So how are they doing that? And then crucially important, obviously, to interview the home workers separately from the intermediaries, to understand their concerns, to understand the importance of the work to them, but also the issues that they may face. By doing that process, it's then possible to bring the different stakeholders together and to understand the challenges that may be present and to look at how best to move forward. And so indeed, within that particular supply chain, we were able to introduce a simple job card system for recording the payments, the work that's been allocated to particular home workers, the piece rates. And it was then possible also to do time and motion studies to check that the piece rates against the minimum wage. And as a result, the supplier agreed to increase the piece rate substantially. So, I mean, there are ways to manage home working, but it takes a little bit of energy and responsibility. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy. There's an interesting question around grievance mechanisms, as we know, a key part of business and human rights frameworks. And there's also a question around legal criteria, ways of distinguishing between different types of home workers. Marlese, would you be able to respond to that question? And indeed, Sarbani may like to add a little bit as well, particularly from the South Asian context. and then we'll look at the other questions.
Thanks, Rowan. I'm going to start, if I may, with the second question, which is a very good and important question. The distinction between self-employed home-based workers and home workers who subcontracted by factories. So it's not so much how many people you work for, but what is the degree of control who makes the decisions. So a self-employed home-based worker would decide what shall I make, what is the time period for when I make it, and how much should I sell it for? So even if it's contracted by a factory, it would be a negotiated price. Whereas a home worker, which is a disguised employee, has no control. They're told, the intermediary will bring the fabric and the buttons and everything to them. They don't decide what they make. They don't decide by when they need to do it by. So it's often a very pressurized context, and they definitely don't decide how much they get paid. So I think that's the distinction there. And then in terms of grievance, and maybe Sarbani can come in here with examples. So WIEGO, HomeNet International, HomeNet South Asia and Southeast Asia worked with affiliates around what would a grievance mechanism look like and a complaints mechanism, and distilled it into principles, which are also, well-known principles. So the first would be that there needs to be meaningful engagement with organizations of home workers at a country level and down to the factory level on what a complaints mechanism would look like. So women know what their constraints are. So for example, in Pakistan, home workers said, we need 3 years to be able to lay a complaint, because sometimes it's sexual harassment, for example. We shouldn't have to pay to go to grievance mechanism. We shouldn't have to have men go with us. Or there needs to be a hotline. Those kind of examples, and I'm sure Sarbani can add to that. The second would be around the governance structure of the complaints and grievance mechanism. Who does that go to, and do they feel safe? So is there a connection with the trade union, or are organizations of home workers represented on that complaints and grievance mechanism? So in Thailand, home worker representatives are part of the governance structure of a complaints mechanism. And then thirdly, they need to know that if they complain, they're not going to lose their work, or that something else is going to happen to them. So safety in that regard. And again, what that looks like in different countries may be different. But maybe I can ask Sarbani if she's got more sort of, perspectives to add to that.
Thank you, Marlese. It's actually similar to what you have said. Home workers, they need a space, they need a safe space where they can actually complain about the injustice that they're facing. And one of the main challenges is that they fear about losing their work. And this is something that has been voiced out for many of the workers within South Asia, even in other countries as well, that even if there is a system set in place, there needs to be a trust. They need to know who the employers are. It has to go beyond the subcontractor level. They need to know where the factories are, who the employers are, and so that the space has to be filled with trust, so that they could easily voice out their concern, and that they would not lose their work. So this is one of the most challenging aspects. We have had many home workers who have actually complained to the subcontractors, the intermediaries who have provided them work. And many home workers have lost their job because of that, because the work is not sent to the employer who is providing them work. There's so much competition among the home-based workers that subcontractors easily stop providing work to a certain home worker, and they shift it to another area. So it is a very risky, and if once a grievance mechanism is in place, there needs to be transparency of all the tiers within the supply chain, and home workers needs to feel trust that they can share and voice out their issues. Thank you, Rohan.
Thank you. And Kohila, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to add to Sarbani what Sarbani mentioned. So we also feel like the complaint mechanism system, which should be easily accessible and less time consuming and resource consuming, because home workers, they have to do their day-to-day activities and the work they have to carry out for their bread and butter. So most of the time when it comes to grievance mechanism, many times the workers have to leave their work and spend a lot of time and energy to make complaint and process it. So the effective grievance mechanism system should be less time consuming, less resource consuming in terms of home workers to access it. And another thing is also if the grievance mechanism system exists within the community, that will be very, very helpful, because I don't think home workers can take a effort and leave their household work and care work at home and travel to make grievances or complaints. I think it's very important that the grievance mechanism should be accessible from the community. I just wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Kohila. There's a question from Viraf for Mousumi around the positive developments that there have recently been in organizing IT and gig economy workers in India, and whether those experiences offer some hope for home-based workers and for their freedom of association and so on. Would you like to respond to that, Mousumi? And in addition, there's a question from Viraf about some of the most effective fora for redressal and remedy that you have come across, again, that could be relevant for home workers and indeed other informal workers beyond factory walls.
I'll take the second question first, Rohan, because we're talking on access to remedy. So Fairware has a complaints mechanism, a redressal mechanism. In each production country where we work, we offer our complaints mechanism to our member suppliers and their workers. This is maintained by Fairware, so there's confidentiality when it comes to access. This number is shared by Fairware with all the production locations from where our brands source via auditors, trainers. Of course, the suppliers and brands are also responsible to refit this number to workers, but Fairware additionally takes this role up when we do our audits and trainings in these factories to create a sense of trust in these numbers. Because, just because there's a number, a worker will not call. Is the number safe? Is there confidentiality? Will my grievance be addressed? Is it going to the right person? So there are multiple levels of issues along with the fear if I will lose my job. So there are multiple factors that affect if a worker will complain or not. I'm extending it to home workers. Coming to the fundamental question of recognition of home workers. For home workers to have access to remedy when it comes to employers, we need to have some amount of formalization in terms of contracts that they have, so that we know who can address it, right? Because a home worker, if via the employers or contractors do not know for whom they are producing, where do we take that complaint to? Do we take it to the government? Do we take it to the supplier? Do we take it to the brand? Who takes it? There are multiple barriers in that level. So it's very important that there is recognition of the supply chain, of the full supply chain by the brand, that where is the final product that they get from is sourced. If it is sourced from beyond their first tier, second tier, third tier factories, they should know the full supply chain. That will also ensure workers knowing where to complain, and also unions to know where to take their complaints from. A lot of times I hear from my union friends that we've got this complaint from this A factory in NCR, but we don't know for whom the worker is producing. So where do we take that complaint to? So we need to look at some amount of formalization in this whole informal economy, and to change the narrative that home working is not bad. Home working is not precarious. The conditions are precarious. That will also reduce the amount of, some amount of fear, public shaming that brands have when it comes to acknowledging homework in their supply chain. Because, if we club both, that home working and the precariousness, though very intertwined, is one and the same, that makes the brand also very fearful of acknowledging it sometimes, not going into that discussion. So we need to also change our narrative when we address this issue of homework and the precarious working conditions that they work in. That will probably help us get critical players onto the conversation table. To the first question of organizing workers, unfortunately, Viraf, I don't have a very clear-cut answer to that, because as Fairwear, we are a big promoter of social dialogue, of workers having a collective voice, but unfortunately, we don't have that bandwidth to organize workers. We do not organize workers. So we see hope that organizations like WIEGO, HomeNet International will do that, will encourage home workers to become a more unified, in solidarity, a common voice. And we are in support of it, but unfortunately, we are not the forerunners in doing it. Yeah, thank you, Ron.
Thank you. There's two more questions which I would like to invite panel to respond to. One is around NAPs, which is obviously the National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights, and so very pertinent to any discussion on due diligence. How useful should NAPs be in actually addressing some of these challenges? Would anyone like to respond to that question? Specifically then in terms of home working, so what would we want to see NAPs provide in terms of homework? Marlese, yes. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Ron. I can really start us off rather than responding to the question. But what WIEGO typically does is we provide technical support for HomeNet South Asia and Southeast Asia on some of the global issues. So we did a brief on the guidance and using the national contact points and how that could be used for advocacy, and then engaged obviously with HomeNet at that stage, South Asia and Southeast Asia and their affiliates. The problem is, if you don't know who you apply for, who you are producing for, then how do you use a national contact point? And I would imagine that the same. So if you don't know who you're producing for, but even if home workers do know who they're producing for, if they risk being fired, if they bring it to the attention of anyone, and they risk losing their job, then they don't want to go that route. And so I'm wondering to what extent those same arguments apply to the national action plans. If home workers remain invisible and not actually visibilized in the national action plans, I'm not sure that home worker organizations could use that, but maybe others on the panel could respond more fully to that.
Thank you. Any other comments on national action plans?
Just a quick remark, Roshan, and I say this from the Indian perspective. There's a lot of critique to the e-Shram portal that we have. I myself have my own inhibitions about it, but I think again to reiterate that let us make ourselves count as home workers. Unless we make us count, policymakers will ignore us. And let's use existing mechanisms in each country that we have. I'm unaware of what is there in others, but what we have to make ourselves count. Because if our numbers are big, our voices will be heard strongly. So I encourage again organizations on this forum today that if you are from India, you have colleagues in India, with all our inhibitions about portals that reflect numbers, let us put ourselves out there as a strong force in the supply chain.
Thank you. Thanks, Mousumi. And that really maps on, doesn't it, to the first step in due diligence, which is to identify and which is to ensure visibility. I'd like just very quickly, Sarbani, if you can respond to the question around home worker organizing, and then we'll move on to the closing part of the session.
Sure, thank you, Rohan. So one of the main role for NGOs and CSOs to empower home-based workers from ground level is, like what Rohan mentioned, is to organize them. Home-based workers are scattered. You will not be able to identify if there's a home worker, living nearby you. So the main point is to organize them into different types of organizing. It could be a home-based worker organization, it could be a trade union, it could be a cooperative, a self-help group, or even a women's group. So there has been a lot of positive examples of a home-based worker being organized in one of these categories. For example, home-based workers being organized into a cooperative. Many home-based workers who had mobility restriction, and I'm saying this from the experience of Nepal, that they had mobility restriction. Their spouses would not let them go outside of the house. But after being engaged in a cooperative, where they're able to save and also take out loan, their husbands were more supportive. And this cooperative is a medium for them to, build their capacity, learn from each other, also understand what is important to them so that they can advocate and they can raise their own voices on the issues that affect them. And there's also another positive example for joining a trade union. For example, in Tirupur, SAVE, an organization in Tirupur, they have helped create a trade union called Anukatam. So there are more than 45,000 home-based workers part of that trade union. And what they do is they unite and they work in solidarity. For example, if any subcontractors cheats them on the wage rates or piece rate wage, they come together and they deal with that contractor. They talk to them, they negotiate with them, so that the contractor starts providing them the wage rate that he actually said that he would provide. So there's a lot of positive examples, and the most important is first to organize them, so that we have clarity on how many home workers there are, and then to build their capacity so that we are all united and we work in solidarity. Back to you, Rohan.
Thank you, Sarbani. There was a question from Christoph around any hazardous tasks that are given to home workers. Would you have any quick response to that?
So many home workers, they're not provided with protective equipments. For example, if a home worker is working on knitting, there's a lot of small dust particles that enters into their body, and later on in the years they develop asthma. Also, there are many home workers who work on pasting stones on cloth, or many home workers who are working on, in the footwear sector, where they're gluing the sole onto the top part of the shoes. So they inhale these chemicals, these glues, these chemicals, which actually tends to negatively affect their health. And I had an opportunity to visit some of these sites, and for me, I couldn't go near that work site. The smell of the glue instantly started burning my eyes. So I'm thinking, how are they, home workers are so used to that smell and so used to that, that environment, that they do not realize that it will affect them negatively in the long run. So there's a lot of home workers who are working in these sectors.
Yes, and I think Kohila's got her hand up, because I think she would also have some significant views on this, Kohila.
Yeah, thanks, Rogan. I just want to add what Sarbani mentioned about the leather sector. Yeah, in our study, it's revealed that the home workers who work stitch shoe uppers from home, they are prone to various kind of health problems, like the various kind of problems, because they have to sit and stitch for long hours. So they often get chest pain, neck pain, shoulder pain. And it is also one of the low wages often workers, they don't have enough nutrition on their nutrition, so they often prone to obesity. And because of the long stitching, the usage of needles, the workers like they have a lot of injuries on fingers, and the home workers, they never get any kind of protective equipment like finger guards or any gloves from the contractor or from the factories. So often the workers, home workers in the leather sector, they stitch a small finger guard from the waist leather, that they use it as a protective equipment, but still they still do get a lot of injuries in their hands. And it is very clear that from our studies, almost all home workers who work from who stitch shoe uppers from their home, they're prone to
Right.
various kind of illness and health issues. Yeah. And because of the many
Thank you.
waste, they also,
Thank you,
yeah,
Kohila.
thank you.
Yes, thank you. And those perspectives are indeed available in the public domain, and you're also welcome to look into the chat and see some of the studies that the panel have been involved in. We have unfortunately come to the end of the session, but I think we have touched upon a range of ways in which, yes, there are challenges, but at the same time that there are some practical steps that can be taken to first understand the supply chain, building trust, facilitating transparency, and identifying the home workers that may be present within garments and footwear chains. And that once these home workers are identified, facilitating extended due diligence, or continuing with the due diligence process. We thank you very much for joining the session, for your engagement, for these very interesting questions, and we do hope that it's been informative. Thank you and farewell.
Thank you.